the next year. And so we're celebrating by doing an adventure in the Boundary Waters Wilderness in northern Minnesota. And so we're planning this trip. But I got to tell you, it's overwhelming sometimes to plan, because the options are myriad and there are so many choices. There's so many things that go into it. But planning leads to a better journey. And I want to look real quick at some of the preparations that went into the Hebrews' experience of deliverance from Egypt. The first thing that you remember over the last few weeks, and we've been working through some of these stories, is the plagues. The 10 plagues that they went through. They had to go through. What was the purpose of these plagues? It was not just judgment on Egypt. It was also a display of the sovereignty of God for his people. Because his people, before they were going to experience freedom, they needed a reorientation. See, all they knew was life in Egypt as slaves. It was their lives. It had been their daddy's lives and their mama's lives and their granddaddy's lives and their grandmommy's lives. And back as long as they could remember, it's all they had ever known. And so they needed a reorientation. And the plagues forced the Hebrew people to rethink and reevaluate everything about Egypt. Because, if you're going to live as a free people, if you're going to live in a new way of life, then when you get out, you can't just go recreate what you've always known. What's the phrase? Hurt people do what? Hurt people. Hurt people. Hurt people. They would have and could never fully appreciate their freedom until they recognized the bankruptcy of everything they had ever known. They had to realize that everything about the Egyptian system that they had grown up with, lived with, and all they had ever known, it was all bankrupt. They could not take Egypt with them. Their experience in Egypt was going to be over. Hurt people, hurt people. They were going to have to get past this. Moving on to a new location or a new relationship or a new fill in the blank doesn't really do anything unless there is also a new you. If God had just released them, they had gone out and they had gone to a new place, they would be in a new place, the same old people, and in all likelihood what they would have done is the oppressed would now become what? The oppressor. The oppressed would become the oppressor. But God gives them plagues. Excuse me, wow. God sent plagues to reveal his sovereignty and his judgment on Egypt for them as well, so that they would understand there is nothing redeeming in Egypt. They would have been destined to become the very thing they had fled from. They needed a new way of seeing the world so that they would not simply repeat the ways of the world. The oppressed become the oppressors. It happens all the time unless the cycle gets broken. The second part of the preparation was this. Remember last week Mike preached on the Passover. The Passover is about remembering to remember. Remembering to remember. The older I get, I've got to go to extreme measures just to remember things. I mean, if you go to my office, there's sticky pads, notepads, and everything. It's all over the place because if I don't, I've got to remind myself just to remember something. And it's an endless cycle that goes on and on. Moses tells the people, look, thank you, Jeff. Well, man, didn't even ask. Appreciate that, Jeff. Get the hairball out. Moses, in preparation for what they're about to experience, basically has to tell people, look, when this is over, when this whole ordeal, when this experience is over, You're going to have to remember this story. You're going to have to find ways to make it come alive again and again and again, and tell your children and their children and their children. You're going to have to remember exactly everything that God took you through. And so Passover becomes an annual festival to celebrate and remember and retell those stories again and again, so that no one ever forgets what God has done. So folks, before we move on, before we actually get on the journey, and we're just talking about the prep of the journey, remember this, don't forget. Don't forget what God has done for you. Don't forget the Red Seas that He has already parted for you. Don't forget the miracles and the hurdles that He's already seen you through or gotten you over. These days we celebrate, some people still celebrate Passover, the Lord's table, baptism, and such. They're kind of like the sticky notes. They're the things that we do to remind us to remember. To help us to remember, so that we do not forget or lose sight of what God has done in our lives. Now, with that said and done, that's kind of the preparation for the journey. I want to begin the journey into freedom now. And I want to look at about five aspects of the journey, 5 realities, 5 truths that we need to take away from the story of the Exodus this morning. The first one is this: finding is freedom is more than leaving. Finding freedom is more than leaving. Freedom is moving. There is a from and a to. You know, when you give Christmas presents, how many of you skip the tag? You just forget the whole tag deal. We got a few of you. But typically, on a Christmas present or a birthday present, what do? You put a little tag on it, and the tag says what? From and to. It's not just a from, and it's not just a to. It's both a from and a to. If you remember, back in Exodus chapter 3, verse 8, when God calls Moses, you remember the story of the burning bush. In verse 8, it says, "So I have come down," this is God talking, "so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians." Now, that's the what? That's the from. I have come to rescue them from the Egyptians. And, he doesn't stop there though, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. It's from and to. If you fast forward to chapter 13, verse 17, he says, "When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter, for God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt armed for battle." Moses took, and skip on down verse 20. "After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people." Finding freedom is not just about getting out of. The bigger question is not just getting out of, but where are you going? Where are you moving to? It's not just freedom from the tyranny of the Egyptians, but also a freedom from the ways and the worship of Egypt. But not only that, it's to a new land and a new way of living. You see, you can't just go to a new place and be the same old thing, and do the same old thing, and be the same old people, and again, the oppressed become the oppressor. There's a from and there's a to. Finding freedom is more than just leaving. Secondly, finding freedom may take the long road. I don't know about you. At this point, this is the time, okay, we check out. It's like, I want it now. We live in an instant society. I mean, we're used to click, done. I mean, it's amazing what can happen at the click of a finger. At the click of a finger, I can purchase something and have it at my doorstep tomorrow. No other culture in the history of life on earth has known that level of immediacy. But finding freedom may take the long road. Look at the passage that we just read. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through Philistine country, though that was the shorter path. They could have gone. There was a more direct way to go. But God didn't lead them that way. You know, one of my kids used to had a phrase. All interstates were called the long, long time road. Because this one knew that once you got on the interstate, it was like, man, we're going to be on this road for a long time. As long as we stayed on local roads, we're probably just going down, down here for a few minutes. But the minute you got on the exit ramp, oh man, we're on the long, long time road. And he absolutely detested the long, long time road. But notice this, God who sees the big picture and knows us better than we know ourselves often takes us on a path to freedom that takes us a little longer than we might prefer. But you see, God knew his people. God knew the people that he was trying to set free. And he knew this early in the process, if they encountered resistance, they might not go. So instead of sending them on the direct, quick route, he sent them a little bit out of the way. I wonder, how often in our lives are we kind of having to go a little bit of an indirect route? Maybe not directly where we want to be or how quickly we expect God to get us from point A to point B. But maybe, just maybe, God knows us a little bit better than we know ourselves and knows that would not be good in the end. Not only that, but he sees the big picture. He knows what else is going on and what else is happening around. He knew his people's hearts and fears, so he led them on an appropriate route. Finding freedom may take the long road. Will you still follow? Will you still follow him when it doesn't look like the road is getting you where you want to be? Third thing, finding freedom may mean facing fear. Finding freedom may mean facing fear. Skip down to chapter 14, verses 10 through 14, the passage leading up to what we read earlier. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, I love this. This is so typical. I hear myself in this. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? Really, God? Is this it? Is this as good? This is your deliverance? This is what you got in mind? What the heck? You got to be nuts. I mean, there's nowhere to go. There's a sea in front of us. There's an Egyptian army behind us. Really? I mean, were you short on graves? You know, we would have been fine just dying back in Egypt. If we're just going to die anyway, let's just leave us alone and let us die. What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Well, yeah, duh, I would choose it too. Moses answered the people, though, do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. You ever been on a lake and seen where there used to be an old road and it just sort of ends in the lake, where they flooded in a valley? It's kind of cool. It's a road that just kind of ends and there's no road and there's nowhere else to go. And that's where they were. They saw no way out, no way through, no way back. And God's answer is what? Stand still. Stand still and see what God is about to do. If you turn and run, guess what you don't do? You don't see. Because if you turn and run, your back is turned to what God is about to do. Sometimes we just have to stand still, stand firm, and wait on God to come through. At the end of their road, they said, look, hey, slavery is better than death. And so a choice has to be made. Back into the known, semi-comfortable world of slavery, or forward into the unknown, uncomfortable world, unpredictable world of following God. That's a tough choice, isn't it? I mean, sometimes, frankly, I would rather just be comfortable. I would rather sometimes go back to, look, it may not have been great back there, but, you know, my brain was kind of wrapped around it a little bit. I got it. Everything made sense. There was a system, you know. Okay. I may not have been real happy, but hey, it's better than not knowing, right? And that's kind of where they were. It's where they were. But God says, you tell the people, stand still. Don't be afraid. Look, fear is real, but it can't rule. Fear is real, but it cannot rule or reign in our lives. Stand firm and you will see God's deliverance. If you run, you can't see. Number 4, finding freedom may require moving into the unknown. Finding freedom may require moving into the unknown. Down in verse 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Why are you wasting your time? The plan's already been set. You're wasting your time here, Moses. Tell the Israelites to what? Move on. Now, isn't it interesting? Stand still, and now move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Skip down to verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. What's God say? Move on. Move on. You can't just stand here forever. Stepping into the sea, the unknown. No, in the ancient world, the sea was the symbol of chaos and evil and the great mystery, the depth. That's where the sea creatures, the Leviathan, lived. And the sea was a mystery, and people were afraid of the sea. And that's exactly what they stand before. Chaos and uncertainty and the unknown. But here's what I want us to notice. God leads them not around, not over. It doesn't say, hey, build a boat and float your way out. But how? Through. He leads them through. And pay attention to this. God goes ahead leading them. He's with them. You know, to me, and I've talked about this many times, one of the most amazing things about God and his way of doing things is this. God always does them with. It's the most powerful word in our language, I believe. God always goes with us. He delivers and sets people free by what? Going through with them. He sets people free from sin by what? By going with them. Look, great passage, 2 Corinthians 5:21. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. That's with. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. In other words, to get us from point A to point B, God became sin for us. He took all of our sin upon himself. He went through sin with us. He doesn't stand over on the other side and say, come on over. He doesn't go in the back and yell and say, hey, get going. He took on flesh and walked through. With and through. Ephesians 4:22 through 24, Paul writes over and over to put off the old self and put on the new. To get rid of deceitful desires and replace them with a new attitude that is righteous, holy, and like God. Finding freedom may require moving into the unknown, but it is a movement. It's a from and a to. And fifthly, finding real freedom results in a new relationship with God. At the end of the story in chapter 14, down in verse 30, down in verse 29, but the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the great power the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servants. When you come out on the other side, everything's new. Everything's different. They saw God's deliverance in their own lives. And the result was this. There was a newfound fear. There was a, whoa. We're not dealing with your average, ordinary dude here. We're dealing with God, there was this new respect. There was this new understanding of just how powerful of a God that they were dealing with here. Not only that, but they placed their faith in him. It was like, okay, that's pretty cool. Maybe we can trust that God's got us. You know, sometimes in our journey of faith, following Jesus, we come to a place where God does something in our lives that when we look back, it's almost sometimes we look back and we're like, was I really saved before? Yeah, let me answer. Yes, you probably were. See, new experiences do not invalidate the past, but they do bring you to a place where your new relationship with God is such that it makes everything that came before it seem like nothing. See, when you see God deliver you, it takes you to a new place with God. And it's kind of like, wow. You know, the really cool thing, Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, about 500 years later, comes along and he says, guys, listen up. See, for hundreds of years, the Exodus from Egypt was the story of Israel's history. It's what the Passover and so many of their festivals all come back to what God did when he delivered them from Egypt. And they retold this story over and over and over. It was the cornerstone of their faith. Jeremiah begins to preach a message 500 years later saying God is about to do something. And what he's talking about is setting them free from their captivity to Babylon. God is about to do something that's going to make Exodus seem like old news. You see, that's the way God sometimes works in our lives. When we see his deliverance, it brings us to a new place that it makes the past seem old and almost like it wasn't even real. See, in a way, we may experience multiple conversions through our lives. Multiple times we come to a place where it seems like God has delivered us anew. It doesn't invalidate the old, but it brings us to a new place with God. Some of us here this morning, as we kind of wrap things up, some of us here this morning, we need that new relationship with God. Some of us, it's a story in the past that, yeah, God, he did something a long time ago. Some of us need to bring our relationship with God up to date and make it current. Some of us need to be set free. Some of us maybe have a habit or a hang-up or a pattern of life or a sin that we are so caught up and enmeshed in that we can't get out. Or there's a place in life, kind of like the Israelites, where they just ended up and found themselves in an extremely undesirable place. And some of us here, maybe we need deliverance. I want to invite you this morning to come and to put yourselves before God and say, okay, God, I'm crying out. I am standing still. I'm not going to run. I'm not going to flee. Let's go through this. I'm going to face this. God, if you'll walk through it with me, bring me to the other side. Maybe some of you, you're saying, I don't know, it's just taking too long. And maybe you just need to say, okay, God, I'm in it for the long haul. I need your deliverance, God. Walk with me. Walk with me through this. Know this, you do not have to live in Egypt forever. God is a deliverer. God is a saving God. But we must face the fear. We must be willing to go the distance. And we must be willing to go. And to go, we have to be willing to trust. Maybe you're here this morning and you just need to begin to trust God. We would love to pray with you. We would love to walk with you. But let God deliver. Let's pray. God, thank you that you deliver, that you save, that you rescue, that you set free. God, do that for us. Set our hearts free. Set our minds free from things that keep it trapped in prison and in prison. God, bring us into a new land where the worship of you is all in all. God, do a work in our hearts this morning, we pray. In Christ's name, amen. If you want to stand.